The billionaire's diamonds caught the light as she stood, pointing at the young black waiter with pure disgust. The entire restaurant fell silent. In seconds, she would unleash words meant to destroy him. But he would respond with just one sentence that would freeze every person in that room and shatter everything they thought they knew about power. What would you do if someone tried to erase everything you've ever been? Marcus Thompson carried plates with the same precision he'd once used to carry state secrets. 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, of coiled restraint wrapped in a crisp white jacket and black bow tie. His dark skin seemed to absorb the restaurant's soft lighting, making him almost spectral as he glided between tables at Le Bernardin, one of New York's most prestigious establishments. The other servers had long since stopped trying to engage him in break-room banter. He was cordial but distant, professional but unknowable, a man who seemed to exist solely within the confines of his shifts. His shoes, polished to military perfection, made no sound on the imported marble. His hands, steady as surgeons, never trembled even when balancing multiple plates of food worth more than most people's weekly groceries. Every motion was economical, purposeful, betraying a training that had nothing to do with hospitality. The wealthy patrons of Le Bernardin saw what they expected to see when they looked at him, if they looked at all. Another young black man in service, another pair of hands delivering their desires, another forgettable face in the machinery of their privilege. They never noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential threats with unconscious precision. They never observed how he positioned himself, back always protected, sight lines always clear. They never caught the micro-expressions that flickered across his face when champagne corks popped too loudly, or when kitchen crashes echoed like distant explosions. To them, he was furniture that moved, a function rather than a person, which was exactly how Marcus preferred it. In his sparse Brooklyn apartment, 2 trains and a world away from the restaurant's opulence, Marcus lived with ghosts. The studio was methodically organized, everything in its place, surfaces clean enough to perform surgery. Military habits died hard, especially when they were all you had left to define yourself. In the bottom drawer of his dresser, wrapped in an old uniform shirt he couldn't bring himself to discard, lay a wooden box he opened exactly once a year. Inside, a purple heart caught dust alongside a bronze star, a Navy commendation medal, and a photograph that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The man in that photo stood proud in dress blues, flanked by 6 other sailors, all of them grinning with the invincibility of youth. Only Marcus and 2 others had made it home, and home had proven to be its own kind of battlefield. The walls of his apartment were bare except for a single frame holding his degree from Georgetown, turned backward so the text faced the wall. He'd done that the day he'd been hired at Le Bernardin, unable to bear the mockery of a master's in international relations hanging above a waiter's uniform. The books on his shelf were the only hint of the man he'd been. Texts in Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, and Farsi, strategic analyses of global conflicts, philosophical treatises on the nature of service and sacrifice. But books didn't pay rent in New York City, and philosophy didn't heal the wounds that woke him at 3 a.m, sweat-soaked and reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. 5 years ago, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thompson had been a different species entirely. Naval intelligence, special operations support, the kind of classified work that happened in rooms without windows and operations without names. He'd been fluent in 5 languages, could break down and reassemble communications equipment blindfolded, could read micro-expressions across cultural divides and extract information from sources who didn't know they were sources. His call sign had been Ghost for his ability to appear and disappear from hot zones without leaving a trace. 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq had earned him commendations that would never be public, and scars that would never fully heal. He'd briefed admirals and ambassadors, had been on first-name basis with CIA station chiefs, had held security clearances that required polygraphs just to acknowledge they existed. The mission that ended everything had started like dozens before it. Bad intelligence was as common as sand in Afghanistan, but this time the bad intel had been bought and paid for. Marcus had smelled the ambush before his unit walked into it, that 6th sense that kept operators alive, tingling at the base of his skull. The orders were explicit. Proceed to target, secure the asset, extract within a 15-minute window. But Marcus knew, with the certainty of someone who'd danced with death too often to mistake its rhythm, that following those orders would mean writing letters to 6 families back home. The building they'd been directed to enter was a kill box, wired and waiting. He'd made the call that defined the rest of his life. He'd refused the order and redirected his unit. 6 men lived because of that decision. His career died in the same moment. The court-martial had been a formality dressed in procedure. Disobeying a direct order in a combat zone, regardless of outcome, was insubordination. That the intelligence had indeed been compromised. That the building had indeed been a trap. That 6 American servicemen were breathing because of his decision, none of it mattered to the manual. The review board had been sympathetic but bound by regulations. Honorable discharge, loss of pension, loss of clearance, loss of everything that had defined him since he was 18 years old. He'd walked out of the proceedings a civilian, a word that fit like a suit 2 sizes too small. The skills that had made him invaluable in Kandahar were worthless in Kansas. Speaking perfect Mandarin didn't matter when no one would hire you to use it. Reading human behavior like a map was useless when every interviewer's expression said the same thing. Overqualified, too much baggage, not the right fit. The descent from operator to waiter had been a series of small surrenders. First came the realization that his network, built over a decade of service, evaporated the moment his clearance was revoked. Phone calls went unreturned. Emails bounced back. Former colleagues looked through him at chance encounters, as if his disgrace might be contagious. Then came the financial reality. The saved deployment pay that seemed substantial in a war zone disappeared into New York rent and medical bills for therapy the VA deemed unnecessary. His car, a small luxury he'd allowed himself, sold to cover 3 months of expenses. Credit cards maxed and canceled. Pride swallowed in increments until there was nothing left to choke on. A cousin in Brooklyn had suggested restaurant work. "They're always hiring," she'd said, not meeting his eyes. "And they don't ask too many questions if you can carry plates and remember orders." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd once memorized complex intelligence reports, analyzed pattern of save data on high-value targets, coordinated multinational operations across time zones and languages. Now he memorized wine pairings and daily specials. The muscle memory of handling weapons translated surprisingly well to balancing trays. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in hostile territory helped him anticipate diners' needs before they voiced them. He was good at the job because he'd been trained to be good at everything, to adapt and overcome. But competence and contentment were different countries, and he was permanently exiled from the latter. The dinner rush at Le Bernardin began at 7:30. A synchronized ballet of black-clad servers and white-jacketed staff moving through carefully choreographed routes. Marcus had table section 3, which included the power tables where deals were made over $1,000 bottles of wine, and careers were destroyed between courses. He'd learned to read these diners like he'd once read insurgents, the nervous energy of inside traders, the predatory calm of corporate raiders, the false bonhomie of politicians working the room. They spoke freely around him, assuming the help either didn't understand or didn't matter. He'd overheard enough to fill federal indictments, but that wasn't his world anymore. His world had shrunk to the circumference of dinner plates and the distance between kitchen and dining room. Victoria Sterling arrived at 8:15 sharp, her entrance orchestrated for maximum impact. At 41, she embodied new money's aggressive aesthetics, sharp-angled suit that cost more than most cars, platinum hair pulled back in a style that looked effortless but required 2 hours in a midtown salon, movements that radiated the assumption that the universe would rearrange itself for her convenience. The hostess nearly genuflected, leading her to table 12, the best sightlines in the room. Sterling didn't acknowledge the greeting, already scrolling through her phone as she sat. Marcus approached with practiced deference, water glass filled before she'd settled, wineless positioned at the perfect angle. He'd served hundreds like her, people who wore wealth like armor and wielded it like a weapon. "Good evening, madam. May I start you with something from our wine selection?" His voice was carefully modulated, accent deliberately flattened to the sort of non-regional American that service industries preferred. Sterling didn't look up from her phone, merely waved a hand studded with diamonds that caught the light like small explosions. "The 47 Chateau d'Yquem. And don't let it sit. I have a call in 20 minutes. $28,000, dismissed as casually as ordering tap water." Marcus retrieved the bottle from the temperature-controlled cellar, his hand steady despite the weight of what he carried. A year of his current salary in a single bottle, intended to be consumed in minutes by someone who wouldn't taste the difference between it and something a tenth the price. The ritual of wine service was theater, and Marcus performed it flawlessly. Present the label for inspection, cut the foil with surgical precision, extract the cork without a sound, the slight bow as he poured exactly 2 ounces for tasting. Sterling took the glass without looking at him, sipped once, and nodded. As he tilted the bottle to pour a proper serving, her hand shot out like a striking snake. "You're holding it wrong," she announced, her voice pitched to Carrie. "The label should face me, not the ceiling. Don't they train you people properly anymore?" The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. You people. 2 words that carried centuries of weight, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been on the receiving end of their impact. Marcus adjusted his grip microscopically, the bottle's label now perfectly positioned. "My apologies, madam. You're absolutely correct." His voice remained steady, but something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The couple at table 11 had stopped mid-conversation. A regular at table 13, a federal judge he'd served dozens of times, set down her fork. Sterling had found her entertainment for the evening, and everyone in proximity had become an unwilling audience. "Apologies aren't corrections," Sterling continued, her voice gaining volume. "This is a Michelin-starred establishment, not some chain restaurant in the outer boroughs. I expect service that matches the prices. Is that too much to ask?" The question was rhetorical, designed to humiliate rather than elicit response. Marcus poured the wine with mechanical precision, each movement calculated to provide no further ammunition, but Sterling was just warming up. When he returned with the amuse-bouche, she examined the small spoon as if it contained evidence of a crime. "This has water spots," she declared, holding it up to catch the light. "Are you incapable of properly polishing silver, or is attention to detail another skill your kind lacks?" Your kind. The phrase slithered across the space between them. Marcus retrieved a new spoon, polished to mirror perfection, and placed it with the same precision he'd once used to disarm explosives. "This is tepid," Sterling announced after a single bite, though steam still rose from the plate. "And the presentation is sloppy. Look at this," she gestured broadly, ensuring neighboring tables could see. "The sauce is off-center, the garnish is wilted. This is what happens when restaurants lower their standards, when they hire based on quotas instead of qualifications." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Other diners shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. This was New York, where public cruelty was often mistaken for dinner theater. The maitre d' materialized at Sterling's shoulder, apologies flowing like wine, but she waved him away. "No, I don't want you to fix it. I want him to understand why it's wrong. I want him to learn something if he's capable." Marcus stood perfectly still, muscle memory from standing at attention keeping him composed while inside, familiar pressures built. The hypervigilance that had saved his life in combat zones activated here, tracking exits, measuring distances, cataloging potential threats. His left hand developed a slight tremor, a tell he'd developed after the incident in Kandahar. He stilled it through conscious effort, forcing his breathing to remain steady. Sterling leaned back in her chair, addressing not just him but the surrounding tables. "You see, this is the problem with diversity initiatives. They put people in positions they're not qualified for, and then we're all supposed to pretend it's fine. But it's not fine. Excellence matters. Standards matter." A woman at table 14 cleared her throat. A man at table 10 studied his plate intently. The restaurant's ambiance had shifted from convivial to tense, conversations dying as Sterling's voice carried across the dining room. She was performing now, energized by the audience, by the power she wielded in this space. "Are you even listening to me?" she demanded, snapping her fingers inches from Marcus's face. "Or is comprehension another challenge? Maybe that's why you're here, serving people who actually contribute to society, people who built things, who innovated, who matter. Not like you, just another charity case, taking jobs from people who deserve them." The words were calculated to wound, each phrase chosen for maximum impact. Marcus felt them land like physical blows, not because they were true, but because they echoed every rejection letter, every failed interview, every moment since his discharge, when the world had looked at him and seen only what it expected to see. His training screamed at him to maintain position, to weather the assault, to give no ground, but something else stirred beneath the discipline, something that remembered who he'd been before the world had decided who he should be. Sterling stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You know what disgusts me most?" She was fully performing now, her voice theatrical in its disdain. "It's this act, this fake humility, this pretense that you belong here, serving people like me. You probably tell yourself you're working your way up, that this is temporary, but we both know the truth. This is your ceiling. This is all you'll ever be. Because people like you lack what it takes to be more." She stepped closer, invading his personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequence. "My taxes probably pay for whatever subsidized housing you crawl back to at night. My charity donations probably funded whatever program gave you this job. You exist because people like me allow it." The dining room had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen noise seemed muted, as if the entire restaurant held its breath. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced before missions, when violence was imminent and choices were running out. The tremor in his left hand spread up his arm. 5 years of suppression, of swallowing pride, of pretending to be less than he was, pressed against his throat like a physical weight. Sterling reached out and grabbed his arm, her nails digging through the fabric of his uniform. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," she hissed. "Show some respect for your betters." The contact triggered something primal. For a split second, Marcus was back in Kandahar, another hand grabbing him in the dark, the decision that would end everything just moments away. His body tensed, muscle memory taking over, a dozen ways to break her grip flashing through his mind like a weapons manual. The grab twist-strike combination that would dislocate her elbow, the pressure point that would drop her to her knees, the psychological warfare techniques that would leave her questioning her own name. All of it available, all of it trained into him, until it was more instinct than thought. But he didn't move. Not yet. In the frozen moment after Sterling's touch, Marcus felt himself standing at a crossroads he'd faced before. The carefully constructed walls between who he was and who he pretended to be groaned under pressure. His vision tunneled, the elegant dining room morphing into other rooms, other confrontations. The smell of Sterling's perfume became cordite and dust. The crystal chandelier fractured into muzzle flashes. His breathing quickened despite his efforts to control it. The tremor in his left hand spread like electricity, threatening to short-circuit the calm he'd maintained for 5 years. He could walk away. He'd done it before, walked away from confrontations, from insults, from the daily degradations that came with being seen as nothing more than his skin color and current circumstance. Walking away had become his primary survival skill in civilian life. Turn the other cheek, swallow the pride, cash the paycheck, repeat. But something about this moment, this particular intersection of cruelty and assumption, struck a frequency that resonated with everything he'd lost. Sterling's nails dug deeper, her grip tightening as if she could physically impose her will. "Well? Nothing to say?" "That's what I thought. You're nothing. A nobody. And you always will be. Nobody." The word echoed in the silence like a struck bell. He'd been somebody once, had commanded respect from people whose names appeared in classified files, had made decisions that shaped international policy, held clearances that most people in this room couldn't dream of obtaining. He'd been trusted with national secrets, had briefed generals and ambassadors, had letters of commendation from people whose names would appear in history books. Now he was nobody, just another black waiter in a white jacket, enduring abuse for tips that wouldn't cover what he used to spend on morning coffee in the officers' mess. The weight of that transformation, the sheer injustice of it, pressed against his throat like hands. He could feel the other staff watching, saw the maitre d' hovering at the periphery, ready to intervene if the help forgot his place. Some of the diners had phones out, ready to capture whatever happened next for their social media feeds. His job, his rent, his survival in this city, balanced on this moment like a coin on its edge. One wrong word, one wrong move, and he'd be on the street. Again. The familiar taste of desperation filled his mouth, bitter and metallic like blood. But then he saw something that changed everything. At table 16, a young black woman sat with what looked like her daughter, maybe 12 years old. The girl watched him with wide eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity. She was seeing not just this moment, but something larger. Seeing how a black man would handle abuse, seeing whether dignity could survive humiliation, seeing what kind of example would be set. In that child's eyes, Marcus found what he'd lost in conference rooms and rejection letters. Not his rank or his medals or his clearances, but the core of who he was beneath all of it. The man who'd chosen his soldiers over his career. The officer who'd understood that some things mattered more than personal advancement. The leader who'd known when to fight and when to stand firm. His breathing steadied as if he'd found his rhythm after being winded. The tremor in his hand stilled through an act of will that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with personal choice. He had something to say. Something that needed saying, not for Sterling, not for the audience, not even for himself, but for that 12-year-old girl who would remember this moment, who would carry it forward into her own battles with people who would try to make her feel like nobody. Marcus gently but firmly removed Sterling's hand from his arm. The motion was controlled, professional, but carried an authority that made her step back involuntarily. Marcus straightened to his full height, shoulders squaring in a way that transformed the waiter's uniform into something else entirely. When he spoke, his voice carried a different timbre than the service industry deference he'd perfected. Each word was precisely chosen and delivered with the clarity of someone used to being heard in situations where every syllable mattered. The accent he'd carefully flattened reasserted itself, not regional, but educated, carrying the weight of podiums and briefing rooms rather than dining rooms and service stations. "Mrs. Sterling," he began, and the use of her name, when she'd never offered it, made her eyes widen. Several diners lowered their phones, sensing this was something beyond social media spectacle. "You're right about one thing. I am somebody who serves. I've been serving my entire adult life." He paused, letting the words settle into the silence like stones into still water. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. I served when a roadside bomb took half my unit outside Kandahar. I served when I had to choose between following orders that would have killed civilians and protecting the men under my command. I chose my men. I chose honor over career. I chose what was right over what was easy." His voice never rose above conversational level, but it carried with the force of suppressed thunder. Sterling's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The maitre d' had frozen mid-step. At table 9, Marcus noticed an older man half rising from his chair, recognition dawning on weathered features. General Patterson, retired now, but still carrying himself with military bearing. Their eyes met briefly, and the general's slight nod conveyed more than words could. "I speak 5 languages fluently," Marcus continued, his tone matter-of-fact rather than boastful. "Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Farsi, and English. I've briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I've coordinated operations with intelligence services whose existence most people don't know about. I have a master's degree from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. I've forgotten more about global security than most people in this room will ever know." Each revelation landed like a precisely placed strike, dismantling Sterling's assumptions with surgical precision. "But you see this uniform and this skin and assume you know my worth. You see a servant where there stands a soldier. You see limitation where there is only transition. You mistake my humility for weakness, my service for servitude." He paused again, allowing the weight of his words to fully register. Sterling's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her performed superiority crumbling like a sandcastle before a tide. "You asked what disgusts you most? Let me tell you what disgusts me. It's not serving food to people who can afford it. There's no shame in honest work. I've cleaned latrines and I've cleaned up after ambassadors, and I've learned that dignity exists in how you do your job, not in what that job is. What disgusts me," he continued, his voice gaining not volume but intensity, "is people like you who measure human worth by bank accounts and skin color, who build their self-esteem on the backs of those they perceive as beneath them, who confuse cruelty with strength and privilege with superiority. You think your money makes you better? I've seen billionaires cry like children under fire, and privates display courage that would humble kings. I've watched powerful men sell out their countries for pocket change. Poor men die for principles. Your wealth is an accident of circumstance. My service was a choice." Marcus reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, withdrawing a small, worn card, his Veterans Administration ID, the photo showing a younger version of himself, the text confirming what he'd said. He placed it on the table in front of Sterling with the same precision he'd once used to place breaching charges. "I've earned my place in this world through sacrifice you can't imagine. I've paid prices you couldn't afford with all your wealth. 7 of my friends are buried in Arlington because of decisions I had to make in seconds. I carry their names every day. Weight your money couldn't lift." The silence in the restaurant was complete, heavy with the kind of attention usually reserved for theater or catastrophe. Sterling stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The card on the table seemed to grow larger, its implications spreading like ripples through the room. Several diners had tears in their eyes. The judge at table 13 had her hand over her heart. General Patterson was now fully standing, at attention. "Tomorrow," Marcus said, his voice returning to its careful modulation, "I'll be here again, serving with the same precision I once used to serve my country, not because I have to, but because I choose to. Because service, real service, isn't about who's above or below. It's about honor, it's about doing your duty regardless of recognition. It's about maintaining standards, especially when no one's watching. Something you've shown tonight you know nothing about." He straightened his jacket with military precision. Every line perfect, every button aligned. "Now, would you like me to bring your main course, or would you prefer another server?" The question hung in the air like a challenge and an offer of grace simultaneously. Sterling's hand shook as she reached for her wine glass, knocked it over. $28,000 of wine spread across the white tablecloth like a golden sunrise, pooling around the veteran's ID card that remained untouched by the spill. "I have to go," Sterling stammered, backing away from the table as if Marcus had become something dangerous, which, in a way, he had. He'd become visible. He'd become real. He'd become a person with a history and depth that shattered her comfortable assumptions about the world's hierarchy. She grabbed her purse with shaking hands, her phone forgotten on the table, her carefully constructed superiority in ruins. As she fled, her heels clicked rapid staccato on the marble floor, a retreat as hasty as any rout Marcus had witnessed in combat. The dining room remained frozen for a heartbeat longer. Then slowly, from table 16, came the sound of clapping. The young girl, the one who'd watched it all, stood and applauded. Her mother joined her, tears streaming down her face. Then General Patterson, his applause measured and respectful, the acknowledgement of one soldier to another. Table by table, the applause spread until the entire restaurant rang with it. Not the performative applause of charity galas or political dinners, but something raw and genuine, an acknowledgement of witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus stood in the center of the ovation, neither acknowledging it nor shrinking from it. He simply nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and closure. Then, with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown all evening, he began clearing Sterling's table. The spilled wine required attention. The abandoned phone needed securing. The work continued, because that's what service meant, doing your duty, regardless of drama or recognition. His hands were perfectly steady now, the tremor gone as if it had never existed. The maitre d' approached hesitantly, uncertainty written across his features. "Marcus, I had no idea. Your service record, your education, your languages. Why didn't you ever say anything?" The question carried genuine bewilderment, the confusion of someone realizing they'd been working alongside a ghost. Marcus paused, enfolding the stained tablecloth, considering his response. When he spoke, his voice had returned to its careful service industry modulation, but something indefinable had changed in its timbre. "Because my worth isn't determined by what I used to be," he said simply. "It's shown in how I conduct myself now. Tonight doesn't change anything. I'll be here tomorrow, doing my job with the same professionalism as always. That's what service means." He looked up, meeting the maitre d's eyes directly. "We all have histories. We all have stories. The measure of a person isn't in their past glory, but in their present choices. I choose to work with dignity. That's enough." As the evening gradually resumed its rhythm, a subtle shift had occurred in the restaurant's atmosphere. Diners looked at him differently now, not with pity or dismissal, but with something approaching recognition. They saw him, but more importantly, he'd reminded himself who he was beneath the uniform, beneath the circumstances, beneath the assumptions. He was Marcus Thompson. He had served with honor. He continued to serve with honor. The venue had changed, but the principle remained constant. At table 16, the young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice carrying in the subdued atmosphere. "Mom, is he really a soldier?" The question held wonder and curiosity, the beginning of understanding that heroes didn't always look like movie posters. Her mother wiped her eyes, pulled her daughter close. "He is, baby. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes or uniforms you recognize. Sometimes they wear whatever life requires. But a hero is about what's in here." She touched her daughter's chest, over her heart, not what's on the outside. As his shift neared its end, Marcus continued his duties with the same precision he'd shown all evening. But something fundamental had shifted, not in the work but in how he carried himself through it. The weight he'd been bearing for 5 years, the weight of invisibility, of diminishment, of being seen as less than he was, had lifted. Not because he'd proven himself to a room full of strangers, but because he'd remembered that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His worth wasn't negotiable, it simply was. In the staff area, he carefully removed his uniform, hanging it with the same care he'd once shown his dress blues. From his locker, he retrieved the small wooden box he'd brought but never opened. Inside, the Purple Heart caught the fluorescent light, its purple silk and gold edge as pristine as the day it was awarded. Next to it lay the Bronze Star, the Navy Commendation Medal, and the photograph of 7 young sailors who'd trusted him with their lives. He looked at them for a long moment, then carefully closed the box. Tomorrow, it would return to the drawer, but tonight, he'd needed the reminder of who he was beneath it all. He left through the service entrance into the New York night, the city's cacophony washing over him like familiar music. The streets looked the same. Yellow cabs hunting fares, pedestrians moving with purposeful anonymity, steam rising from subway grates like urban geysers. But something fundamental had shifted in how he moved through it all. He'd found his voice again, not the one that commanded troops or briefed officials, but the one that spoke truth to power, that chose dignity over degradation, that refused to be diminished by others' limitations. As he descended into the subway station, Marcus thought about the young girl who'd watched him stand his ground. He hoped she'd remember not the confrontation, but the choice. The decision to meet cruelty with truth, to answer assumption with fact, to maintain dignity in the face of those who would strip it away. He hoped she'd remember that strength wasn't always loud or violent, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply refuse to be made small. The train arrived with its familiar screech and rumble. Marcus found a seat, just another New Yorker heading home after a shift. Around him, the city's diversity sprawled in all its complexity. Construction workers with dusty boots, medical residents in scrubs, artists with paint-stained fingers, executives with $1,000 briefcases, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own dignity, each serving in their own way. The train pulled away from the platform, carrying him home. But for the first time in 5 years, Marcus Thompson wasn't running from something. He was simply moving forward, carrying his history without being crushed by it, wearing his present without apology. Some battles, he reflected as the city lights blurred past the window, are won not with force or violence, but with the simple act of refusing to be diminished. Some victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from remembering who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise. Tonight, in a Manhattan restaurant, surrounded by wealth and power, a waiter had won such a victory, not by becoming what he'd been, but by being fully who he was. Marcus Thompson, veteran, waiter, human being, dignified in all of it. Would you have found the courage to speak your truth when the world tried to silence it?